Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Johanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Kári Tulinius. Kári is an Icelandic poet and novelist. He and his family moved back and forth between Iceland and Finland like a flock of migratory birds confused about the whole warmer climes business. He has published two novels, two poetry books, and has been a journalist, publisher, and a magazine and book editor. His poetry and short fiction have been translated into English and have appeared here and there, so if you Google his name and poem or story, you should find some of his work. Kári, thank you for joining me today to talk about the literary culture in Iceland and how it manifests during the Christmas holidays.
Thank you for having me on.
Iceland has a very unique literary culture. Can you tell us more about how storytelling, reading, and writing have for generations been literally life-saving and life-giving for your people?
Well, yeah, I suppose I should start with some context, if you will, and go back to the sort of very beginning of the Icelandic settlement, which was in the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. And so Iceland was just is still pretty far away from everywhere, and especially anywhere that people sort of generally want to live, where it is warm and pleasant. And so Iceland was initially discovered by people from Scandinavia who probably were originally kind of blown off course. These sort of earliest stories are about people being blown off course and finding Iceland. And from archaeological discoveries in the recent sort of decade, 2 decades, it's become apparent that the first people to live in Iceland were there seasonally, and were just there to sort of gather bird meat and fish and seals and walrus tusks and other valuable things that they would then take back at the end of the summer, back to Scandinavia. And then slowly, sort of, it seems first slowly, and then all of a sudden, the uh, people started to settle there, and so the people who settled there are maybe sort of divided in two, in that there was the sort of upper echelon of society, which was mainly well-to-do farmers, or farmers' sons, I suppose, from Scandinavia, especially from the region that's now Norway, who moved there with livestock and their sort of workers, who, and then they would sort of give their workers their sort of their own farms that would be kind of their almost like subsidiary farms. But then on a sort of the lower echelon was a people who were either slaves or kind of low position workers from the British Isles, seemingly, especially from the kind of Celtic part of the British Isles, so the Hebrides in of Scotland and Ireland and Scotland, and this sort of the mix of people that settles in Iceland in the ninth and 10th century. And then, and sort of, slowly the sort of society is formed, and the way it sort of is organized is that there are these the whole country is divided into these sort of chieftaincies, where there's like a chieftain who kind of rules this sort of district, and then all of the chieftains in the sort of, like, say, let's say the east of Iceland will sort of gather together and have this parliament, and then the same happens in the north and the west and the south, and then once a summer they will gather together for the whole country. And that was kind of the organization, and you get this sort of stable society that becomes pretty wealthy, seemingly largely from the sale of wool, and but then in the 11th and 12th, 13th centuries, it becomes kind of important to them to have a sort of a self-image, and the way that you create a self-image that is kind of separate from just the wider sort of Nordic, sort of Norse community is that you start telling stories. And so they would start, they probably this started orally, but it's not really, it's lost to history essentially how it begins. But they seemingly start by telling stories of local sort of holy, bishops and sort of figures like that, and uh, telling stories of their ancestors, and quickly it becomes this kind of whole storytelling tradition, which are known today as the sagas. And this is pretty unique in at least in Europe, where there's a strong vernacular writing culture that's very focused on just the secular society. And so they start writing these stories about their ancestors, who and at this point Iceland is has become Christian, but they remember it's been, it's only happened like 2 centuries before, so they know that, the settlers who came here, their ancestors who sort of built the society, they were pagans. So they start telling these sort of stories about their pagan ancestors, uh, you know, doing doing all kinds of bad things because they were often Vikings and they would be getting into sort of blood feuds. And there's sort of sense that when you're reading them, and they're very, I should say, they're very entertaining, because this is essentially uh stories about strong personalities clashing, and sort of trying to get sort of, trying to either to get one over on the other, or try to sort of settle things. So you have these anything from like a sword fight to like, poetry battles almost, or to people sort of playing tricks on each other, and just to sort of like to give an example, there's one of the sagas called the Saga of Grettir the Strong, where there's a scene where a whale washes up on the shore near these two farms, and the people on the farms really want to sort of get um, get the sort of whale carcass for themselves, because that's so much meat. That's meat enough for, on one whale there's meat enough for an entire winter, which in Iceland is no small thing. And also you can use the blubber uh for to burn it for light. And so they have this, so there's this scene where these two rival farms sort of come together and have this fight over the and it's kind of, it's both kind of slightly, horrible, because they're like, trying to kill each other, but it's also kind of ridiculous because they're like flinging like whale blubber at each other, and like trying trying to sort of get their sort of uh, get sort of control of this big pile of whale meat. And so you get that, and you also get these, like, say, like in another saga there's a or actually in the same saga there's a famous scene where the hero Grettir the Strong has to is basically accepts uh staying in a farm where there's a ghost that comes and kills people, that he will like fight the ghost. So you can have this sort of both these very realistic scenes, and then there's also this sort of supernatural, because of course at the time, this is the Middle Ages. People, uh, people considered ghosts just, part of nature. It was just a normal thing. And so so over the course of mostly the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, I get this huge, or well, by medieval standards, a huge body of work. I think there were probably the around like something like 100 different sagas, which are, can be about, the can be about many things. It can be about the Icelanders themselves. It can be about the contemporary people of Iceland. It can be about like adventures in foreign lands, and there's one about the Alexander the Great. It's that kind of. But then you have this stays within the culture, like as a kind of very important thing. And then the people start as taste change, then people will change it. Like for instance, you get in the sort of early modern era, once you get into the 16th century and the 17th century and the 18th century, you start to get these um, long poems that are based on the sagas and also based on other things, because that was what was entertaining to people at the time. And so that whole so that early flowering of literature becomes from the very beginning a very important part of Icelandic culture. And so once you get to the 19th century and the 20th century, when Iceland starts to want to become sort of independent, you get that becomes the kind of the whole basis for the national self-image. Is like we Icelanders, we told these stories. We are a real nation among nations because we contributed this to the world. And so that's kind of how this aspect of our culture has been incredibly important.
You also in Iceland have a really high literacy rate, one of the highest in the world. How does that connect to your history?
That is actually sort of one another thing about Iceland is that from about the middle of the 18th century, the law a law is passed by the King of Denmark, who was the colonial sort of overlord of Iceland at the time, um, that all children in Iceland that became confirmed um, would have to learn how to read from the local priest. And this was and this became and it's sort of and it's kind of interesting because at the same time there's lots of horrible sort of natural catastrophes happening in Iceland. Like there are these eruptions in a volcano called Laki, which just devastate the countryside. So it's so this you have the so at the same time it's a sort of literacy spreading and has become not universal but like incredibly common by about the 18th century. But at the same time, the population of Iceland has gone to like very serious decline. And so you end up in this sort of slightly sort of strange situation at the beginning of the 19th century, where you have a sort of a very highly literate but very poor and devastated uh, society.
So it seems like there's also been a real emphasis on having literature available in Icelandic in your own language. Can you explain how the publishing industry in Iceland was able to thrive during that time?
Well, there was really the publishing industry in Iceland before the 20th century are essentially just there are people who have printing presses. And in before like let's say before about 1800, that meant the church. There were two bishoprics in Iceland, and they had printing presses. And of course, what they mostly published was um, all kinds of they would publish these homily books or Bibles in Icelandic, or things of that nature. So for a long time, the more important uh, part of the literary culture or publishing culture was the manuscript culture, where people would write up old manuscripts, either to copy them or to write them up before if they were starting to get damaged. And those would be either spread around and or given to other people. Like it seems possible that the reason why we have so many sagas for the Middle Ages is that those were essentially the only thing that Icelanders had to give to each other, because Iceland doesn't really have much in the way of precious things, basically, like that, that you can sort of present to someone. But a book is a nice gift. And so then so you have these manuscripts where people are writing down poems and these all kinds of different things, where they can be like, what, sort of natural history or sort of thing like that, and that gets spread around quite a bit. And then around 1800 you start to get the um, basically sort of officials of the state, the sort of head of the bureaucracy at Iceland, starts publishing books, and they can be books that are for like teaching kids to read, like better farming techniques, these sort of these kind of things that are there. And then not law, well, I mean, a few decades after that, you start to get you start to see newspapers and things like that, and a magazine. But a lot of that is also published in Denmark, because that was in Copenhagen was the center of of the Danish state, and Iceland was at that point part of the Danish state. So you get these like usually young men who get sent to the university to educate themselves in law, or to become priests or something like that, or doctors. And they would also publish, they would, as students do to this day, they would get up to all kinds of other projects, and they would publish magazines and sometimes even books.
I'm curious why in Iceland, if Denmark colonized for a time, why you have a different language than Denmark. How were you able to keep your language intact even though you were under colonial rule?
Well, the main reason, I think, is we were just very far away. Is that Iceland is pretty far away from from Denmark. And so, for instance, there were never any real attempts to get to sort of levy troops from Iceland by the Danish state, because if you went to Iceland, if you sailed from Denmark to Iceland uh, to get troops and then bring them back to Denmark, the the war would probably be over by then. So there was like really no point. And so you have so you also have these, so everything that all communication, there's such a huge lag between communication between Iceland and Denmark, so you just don't have any kind of the pressures that, like, say for instance, with like Ireland and England, where people could just move to Ireland um, very easily. That was never really the case in with Iceland and Denmark.
Iceland has become famous for the Jólabókaflóð, which is the Christmas book flood. And I understand that really came about because of World War II. Can you tell us about that history?
Yeah, so by the beginning of the 20th century, you start to get publishers in Iceland and bookstores. Like the biggest bookstore chain in Iceland is goes back to like the late 19th century, though of course for the longest time it was just one one bookstore. But they and then you start to get these books, and the sort of actually the first major publishing phenomenon in Iceland were these cheap paperback versions, or something like paperbacks of the Icelandic sagas, where for the first time it was like the whole corpus was available to people. So that's sort of the beginning of the sort of the popular Icelandic publishing industry. And then you start to get novels written in Icelandic, and of course, poetry and other things like that. And then so you start to have these publishers whose main job is being publishers. And then by the Second World War, what happens, what gives the publishing industry a real sort of leg up, is that one of the few things that aren't rationed or are very lightly rationed due to the war is paper. It's like, so the war was going on, so you couldn't like order fancy giftware from from the continent or really anywhere. And so, but you could, there was plenty of paper was imported, and so the it was possible to print books, and so this was the main thing that was available. And because the sort of a nice thing about books is that uh, there's so many different ones. So it was possible to have like a wide array of gifts for different kinds of people that were just books. So that in during the Second World War, that's sort of the sort of material reason why there's such a sort of a wide selection of books to give to people. But the other important thing is that this is sort of the height, sort of the peak of Icelandic sort of civic nationalism, because this is when Iceland becomes independent, which is in 1944. And because Icelanders had built their national identity on books and storytelling and literature, it was also kind of a very sort of appropriate thing, sort of for the mood of the time, to be giving new Icelandic books, because to show that modern independent Iceland was also linked to this sort of you know storytelling literary past. And so then you had so so that is when kind of you start to get this flowering of Icelandic publishing, and that pretty much becomes a sort of a regular thing, that the whole cycle of Icelandic publishing is built around Christmas. Is that you have to produce a bunch of books that people want to give. And so it's another, because there are other culture which have these sort of seasonal literary cultures. Probably the most famous is the French publishing. I think it's the autumn, where they have the le rentre littéraire, I think. Um, I should have looked this up before I said it out loud. But the but the so the but what is sort of even, it's in some ways even more extreme in Iceland, because from the in the sort of 3-4 month period before Christmas, so from, let's say, September through December, half or even more than half of all the books that are published through the year are published during that time. And so that's and they're almost like a lot of them are published like in hardcover. And then you start to get this where people try to kind of figure out, okay, what books are good, because it all happens so quickly that no one really ever has time to read a book before giving it. so so people, some enterprising people will go and just sit in book cafes, and then just with a pile of books and like sort of looking at them. But other people just trust the okay trust that they've liked a book by this author before. The person that they're giving to has liked a book by this author before, so buy another book by that same author. Or they've heard from someone who heard from someone that that book is good, or the critics like it, or like they just go into a book. Like, I used to work in bookstores in Iceland, and you'd sometimes get people who are just, I'm looking for a book for a um 58-year-old woman. Like, what is she like? Oh, I don't really know. She's like my wife's aunt. But I have to find a book for her. I was like, okay, well, and then you just have to show them, okay, do you think that, they'll like this novel? It's like, oh, I don't know. And then sure, and then they'll just sort of take it, and then, but of course you'll get also people with like very specific things like, oh, I have a nephew who like really loves tractors. Do you have a children's book about tractors? And I was like, oh, I'll see what I can find.
So what is the scale of this? Because the way it seems from the outside looking in is that everyone is buying and giving books in Iceland as Christmas gifts. Is that what it is really like for Icelandic families?
It's rare. It's rare that someone doesn't get at least one book, and it is not as like now, people will also give people, um, like gadgets and uh, cooking courses and sort of all that thing, or um, tickets to the theater, that sort of thing, of course. But it's rare that someone will not get like at least one book, and most people will get like two or three. And I it and so it's I'd say, yeah, I'd say most people, and I know people who for one reason or another haven't wanted to get books. Like for instance, say if they are uh uh well, to give two examples, like one person I know who's dyslexic and prefers to listen to audiobooks, just told people not to give her physical books for Christmas. And then another friend who um is a copy editor just was like,
I'm all
don't,
set on my
yeah.
books. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yeah. And so would also requested not no books for Christmas, but it's pretty common. It's like very, and people will sort of will be sort of excited about it. Like there's a the publishing association every, I think in November, will publish this sort of catalog of all the books. Well, not all the books, but basically all the books that people are willing to pay money to advertise in this catalog, that goes to most almost like every home in Iceland. Like and so people will read through them and trying to figure out what they want, and either or what their friends and relatives will want.
I have this cozy image of all Icelanders up on Christmas Eve reading new books and drinking hot cocoa. Is that accurate or no?
It's I wouldn't say it's like everyone, but it's a lot of people. Just I'd say that about at least half of Iceland will, at the end of Christmas Eve, because you give gifts on Christmas Eve, will go to bed with a book. And many people would have it as their sort of goal to finish one book on Christmas night, usually one of the shorter one of the shorter ones. And I used to do that, but that was before I had children. So,
And your love of sleep changed
well,
in
my
that way.
my love of sleep and sort of involuntary um need to sleep, at least before by one in the morning. But no, it was when I was younger, I would often like stay up until like 5 in the morning, just finishing a book. And because in Christmas Day in Iceland is not really a sort of is the Christmas Eve is the big holiday,
Mm.
and Christmas Day is generally that you will go and like say go and visit your grandparents in the afternoon, and then meet your cousins and things like that. So that's so you'd always be able to sleep in on Christmas Day, also because Christmas Day you would just eat leftovers from Christmas Eve. So that's that was so people sort of would take advantage of that.
When I was in elementary school, we would sometimes get a reward for being good students or reaching a certain milestone with a readathon. Have you heard of a readathon?
Yeah, we there was I remember during COVID there was like a national readathon in Iceland, and so they those do happen. And they also, I think they have every spring in Iceland. They will have these readathons in the elementary schools, and then whoever, I think, either it's like which class. I think it's like per class, like whatever class like in Iceland reads the most books will get like an award or something.
I just love this idea of a Christmas Eve readathon. And I think it says something about Iceland and the people there and what you value. What do you think that says about you?
Well, I mean, who doesn't like a good story and a plate full of chocolates? And
No one doesn't like that.
so it's
I'm,
yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, and I was just gonna say that, and it's very often that sort of in during, because they're on Christmas Day, and then the on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, you'll have these family gatherings, and having read, or a book or most of a book or something like that will give you then something that you're able to talk to with people. So that's also kind of, and also you can talk with people that isn't I don't know, politics or sports or or things that people get very emotional about. So that's also nice.
That sounds like something we could adopt here, I think. Other things to talk about. I'm really curious because it's almost Christmas. Which books are popular this year? Which books did you buy to gift this year?
Um, the actually, I was just there's actually a slightly funny story. Like, I don't know what books are popular, and as far as I can tell, no one does, because the main bookstore chain in Iceland, they had a ransomware attack their uh on their computer
Really?
system. Yeah, so they haven't, like, as far like their website is just down. So that's like there's no way to know like what the most popular books in Iceland are right now. And
Oh my
but
goodness.
yeah. But there are some books that are coming out that I'm excited about. Like, there's a new book by a writer called Auður Ava Ólafsdóttir, who has actually been published in English. Her latest book has a kind of a funny name. It's called DJ Bambi, uh, and which
DJ
it's a
Bambi.
Bam. Yeah, I have no idea what that w- why it is called that, or what it means. But yeah, she has like several books. Like one called The Greenhouse, and another book called Hotel Silence, that have been published in English, are very good. I'm very I'm very excited about that book, and I'm hoping to get that for Christmas. And that other and so yeah, but other sort of, there's also like crime novels for like the last couple of decades have been very popular in Iceland, and there are always these new books every year. And again, they've also been translated into English. Probably the best known ones are another writer called Yrsa Sigurðardóttir, and it's Yrsa Yrsa, and then Arnaldur Indriðason, and they're both fairly, they're good at their thing. So but uh and I'm trying to think, and it's sort of I'm trying to think what would be other writers that are coming out this year that have books that have been translated into English. Oh, one writer who I don't remember. She's a historian and a poet, and one, I think she has a book this year in Icelandic, but a book that was just published in the US. It's called Hero Stories. Her name is Kristín Svava, and what it is, it's these poems she wrote based on stories by Icelandic midwives as they were traveling around Iceland, to like very rural farms, often in the depth of winter. So they would be going through deep snow or over like half frozen or frozen lakes and so on. So it's which is I think probably is fits with the sort of uh, landscape and history of Idaho as I imagine it.
You're probably not too far off. I always, I guess when I think of Iceland, I sometimes think of Wallander. Wallander. Have you heard
Yeah,
of him?
yeah, I read, but yeah, that's those are very. I think I read all of the Wallander series, though those are take place in Sweden. Though I think probably the best known Wallander actor is Kenneth Branagh, was it's very much not Swedish,
No, no.
but he can brood convincingly, so that's the main
He's
part.
an excellent brooder. That is right. You also, Kári, have two young children. Which books will you be getting for your children this year?
Well,
Are you
I
allowed
was
to say?
Yeah, I think, well, neither of them speak English, so I think I'm
Okay.
trying to phrase it so that I don't say, well, there are a couple of children's book that I was going to get them. One that's kind of um that's from this sort of long running series of children's book that my daughter likes reading, and then another which is a kind of a new kind of fantasy-ish story. Um, and then I also there's a book that because my son has kind of enjoys these kind of funny sayings and phrases. There's just been a book published called the Dictionary of Phrases, essentially, where you
Mhm.
can get like it's like well-known phrases, and then there's like a QR code, and then you look the QR code, and it will like play you like a video, like say if it's like from a TV show, then it will play you the phrase in that you had. So those were the three ones that I'd thought of. And then they're also getting Finnish books because my their mother is Finnish, and that's their other language. So that's kind of uh but yeah, no, it's something that I think about. I haven't quite completely decided on the book for my son because, well, like it's sort of one of the part of the sort of book buying culture is to go to bookstores on the day before Christmas Eve, and just sort of because then you'll have like they'll be completely slammed with people, and it's just sort of you just let yourself be sort of carried by the current sort of past these sort of book stands sort of looking for things, and so I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that, if it's if the weather and allows it.
Well, since you're talking about books for your son, I have loved this series of books, How to Train Your Dragon by Cressida Cowell for my boys, and they do take place in um, a fantasy version of Iceland and Scandinavia. So if you're looking for something enchanting, and listeners, I always recommend How to Train Your Dragon. The audiobooks are especially fun, and it is one of those series that with each book, the characters age and the maturity of the reading level ages. The actor David Tennant voices the audiobooks, and he's wonderful. So
Yeah,
if you
those books
like
have been.
dragons and adventures and pirates and shenanigans, you're gonna like these books.
I think everybody loves a dragon. I think yeah, they have been translated into Icelandic, so that's not a bad sort of a bad thing. There was also a book that came out this year, I think, an Icelandic book about uh, well, not exactly fire breathing, but speaking of fires, like about volcanoes and like how to. It's like sort of both a book about just like a funny children's book, but also a book about what do you do when you're near a volcano, because that's something you have to learn when you're a child in Iceland is like how to behave around volcanoes.
So speaking of volcanoes, I know you are not in Iceland right now, but in the news we're hearing a lot about volcanic activity and earthquakes in Iceland, and I hope your family and your community is doing well.
Thank you. Yeah, the there were not not very close to Reykjavik, but like, you know, pretty near. I think within like say 50 miles of Reykjavik city limits, there was a these magma movements underground, and they really devastated this community of a town called Grindavik, which is on the south coast, and the people there are still haven't been able to return home, and it looks like they won't be able to do that before Christmas. Though that's of course the hope, but the activity has lessened a lot, but there's still some displacement underground, so it's not safe. It's and so it's a yeah, Icelandic nature has always been dangerous to humans. I mean, you know, we get a lot from it as well, but it's never it's never it isn't hard to uh, be find yourself in a very dangerous situation in Iceland, and which I suppose also is why people have wanted to stay inside with a book.
Right now
Especially,
it's all coming together.
yeah.
The focus on cozy and inside. Well, Kári, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a treat to learn more about this beautiful part of your culture, and I appreciate you sharing your book recommendations with us. And we wish all of our friends in Iceland well, and I hope that everyone can be home soon and safe.
Thank you.